In this video, you learn about if you currently are or ever have been in a non-dualistic experience and what that means. We'll completely skip the interpretations and philosophies and instead focus on the experience of actually being in a non-dualistic experience. What does it feel like? How does it affect your senses? How do you perceive the world differently while you are in a non-dualistic state? To make it easier to understand, I'll share the second time I ever had a non-dualistic experience, which was a few months after I was ordained as a Buddhist monk in Sri Lanka. This must have been around 2009, and I had been meditating at a small meditation center in Kandy for a few months. And I remember this one sitting when I was sitting down, and all of a sudden there was a shift. Something just fell away. And I remember opening my eyes and looking around and thinking, it's so quiet here. Something is different. And I couldn't quite put a finger on what it was, but I sat for a few more minutes and I just looked around me. And everything was different. It was like I opened up my eyes and I was somewhere completely different. I wasn't any longer in the space I was when I started meditating. I got up and I walked around, and I remember there was a bookshelf full of books, and everything felt holy. Everything felt spiritual. Like I was in a, you know, when you go in a church and you have that feeling of just this is almost like you can't talk loud. You have to be a bit quiet because there's this aura, this sense of everything is sacred. You shouldn't disturb it. It's perfectly exactly where it is, and you just let it be, and you can walk around there, but don't make any noises. Don't disturb the silence, this like spiritualness that's in there. And again, this silence, many people talk about how all you need to do to become non-dualistic is to stop. And what they mean is this stopping is that there's a quietness that comes when you're no longer pushing and pulling against the world around you. Instead, you're just experiencing it. And it is blissful. It's incredibly powerful. So I walked out and it felt like I was alone. It felt like I was the only person on the planet. There was no one else there because I couldn't feel the sense of anything else outside being real, or that I wasn't real. It was just there. It was like there was a painting, a 3D painting that I was walking around, and I was just moving around in this space. So I walked out. And this sounds a lot like I've talked to people who are taking trips on LSD or all kinds of drugs, and they say, oh yeah, I've experienced that. That's exactly what it was like to take drugs sometimes, unless it goes wrong, because then it can be very different. And there was this sense of just general well-being, and I didn't feel like I was observing things. It was more like everything was just there, and I'll come back to this later, what that means. So I walked out, and there was a puddle, and I remember there was a driveway, and there was a puddle of water there. And I sat down, I'm not kidding, I sat there for half an hour, and I took my hand and I just put it in the water. I put it out of the water, and I looked, what does it look like when the water just came off my fingers, and the waves on the pond, like, it wasn't even a pond, it was like a small puddle. Yeah. So I just put my hand up and down, and I would just feel, what does that feel like? And I would touch the water and feel like, what does it feel like to have wetness on your skin? And I would just feel my fingers, and like everything, this tactile sensation was so intense, so real somehow, so different from how it normally feels. So sitting there looking at this puddle and just like up and down, and then I thought, oh, this is a non-dualistic experience, because I'd read about them, and I started looking around me, and everything was so different. The colors were so clear, and it was like everything was sparkling almost. And then I remember walking up to a flower, and I looked at the flower, and I was like, oh, is the flower looking at me, or am I looking at the flower? And it felt almost like I could move my consciousness to the flower, and I was looking back at me, and I was standing there for quite some time, and I couldn't figure out who was looking at who. Am I the flower? Is the flower me? Like who the heck is looking at who? The flower was the thing that eventually kicked me out of it. Wait, it wasn't really kicked out. It was the immersion into the non-dualistic state was rather subtle. I just felt like a shift. But then when I got out, it more kind of simmered out. Like it wasn't like that. It happened slowly over time. So when it started falling apart was when I was looking at this flower and was getting all spiritual. This was 2009, it must have been. So I was just a newly ordained monk, and I was really onto the spiritual path, and I thought I'd figure something out, and like everyone does when they have a non-dualistic experience, because they can be. They're not always like that, but they most of the time are really powerful. So I started thinking about this whole thing. Am I the flower? Is the flower me? And I tried to observe, and I went back and forth, and I was doing that. And then eventually I was thinking too much. And during this whole time, the thoughts were like, I had thoughts, but they were very far back. It was not like they were in the forefront, more they were back in the background. I could hear thoughts, but they were not really important, and I could focus much more on what's happening around me than what was actually happening in my thoughts. So if you've ever had a non-dualistic experience, some of the things you'll notice is that you probably recognize the thoughts go to the back. It feels like thoughts drop away, and they can drop away for a long time. Since that time, I've had thousands of these experiences, and I've spent years experiencing life like this, and it just changes over time. But the thoughts will gradually go to the back of your mind, so they're not so up front. Another thing that, since I was meditating so much, I was very aware of how my perceptions were of my sense doors. But it might not be obvious the first time you do this, but you'll notice that there's it feels like when you're watching, so for most people, if you hold out your finger like this, I hold it forward, it feels like vision is coming from here going to there. There's a perspective. So it feels like I'm having the perspective of the observer observing forward. And in a non-dualistic state, you don't feel that. It more feels like everything just is. It's like vision is not happening from somewhere. Vision just is. It's just there, kind of. Which is one of the reasons why we feel this silence, is because you are no longer having the sense of, I'm reacting to everything. I call it the distortion principle, meaning that you have you and the things around you, and you push and pull against them. You have a relationship. So when you feel, my hands are quite cold, so I can be pushing against that, creating a distortion, which means that I'm not actually feeling, what does it feel like when the snow is falling on my fingers? Well, right now I am pretty much feeling it, but there's a sense of pushing against things, and then you don't experience reality the way it is. This is a thing that drops away in a non-dualistic experience. You don't have that locus of perception. Things are just there. And that is so calm. It is such an incredible experience to have, and it's not that what many people think, that you need to come to heaven to see something magical, you need to have powers. When you're in a non-dualistic experience, you realize that they say heaven is already here, and that is so true, because your senses are so much more than what you generally experience. So you don't need these peak experiences. They're actually much more subtle layers of reality, not reality, subtle layers of your senses that you can experience. And in a non-dualistic experience, that's what you experience. So the centeredness of looking somewhere disappears. You'll also notice how there's a quietness. Many people say, just stop. Just stop, and you'll have non-duality. And what that means, again, is this distortion that I'm talking about. You pushing against the world. When that falls away, everything just feels like it stops. So I no longer felt like I was here and I could have a sense of this out there, which is why I lost my sense of locality. So when I opened my eyes for my meditation, it was like I had never been there, because the sense of having been somewhere is a distortion. You're pushing and pulling. Okay, I have a sense of this is safe, this is not safe, and that disappears. So it's just everywhere feels new. Wherever you go, it's like it's a new place, which is coincidentally, if you go on vacation, that is very similar to what you feel there. You go to space and you've never been there, and it feels like, wow, this is so incredible. But if you go to that same place for a week or 2 weeks, it doesn't feel so incredible anymore. That's a sense of non-duality, because you're experiencing without this pushing and pulling. It's a new experience. Maybe not as strong as a non-dualistic experience, but it still has those qualities. Another important thing is that non-dualistic experiences don't have to be a specific way. This time was the second time I had one, and then it was really like, hallelujah, like one of those really powerful experiences. The first time I had it was completely different, and I barely felt anything at all. It was like, well, I did, but it was very, very different. And gradually they will change. So don't expect or search for an experience that is special. Instead, search for these differences in how your sense doors work, how you perceive vision, how you hear, how you feel. There's this sense of just moving around. You just move and everything is smooth. Another interesting thing is when you have thoughts, they feel so solid. So, not solid. They feel so certain. It's no longer this guessing like, oh, am I true? Is this false? Like, it feels like this is the way it is, because you're no longer pushing and pulling against your thoughts. So they feel really like this is truth, which is why people in these states tend to philosophize a lot and think that they know the truth. But the only thing that's happening is that they're experiencing their thoughts without this dualistic feeling where you're pushing and pulling. So everything feels like you've discovered reality as it really is, but it's still just a thought. So philosophizing or going too far into these things is ironically one of the things that are going to kick you out of being in a non-dualistic state. So my advice to everyone who, no matter what kind of meditation you're doing, is to search less for things and just stop the searching and instead just observe. If I would have just continued observing, what does it look like? What does it feel like when observing this flower and my sense stores and the things happening? I would have stayed in these states, that state, longer, that time. Have you ever had one of these experiences? Is this something that rings true? Because for most people, if they have experienced this, they'll recognize at least some of these cues. So I'd love to hear what your experiences are. If you can relate to it, was it completely or is it completely different from you? How did you experience it? It's good to share so we can see what other people experience when they're going through these things.